War Stories, Part 10. As dirty a business as the world has ever seen, 1939 through 1945. More than half a century now separates us from a Second World War. The number of films, TV documentaries, and books still produced on the subject show that it continues to exert a powerful fascination. Today, the numbers of those who actually fought in the war is rapidly dwindling. But many people have grandparents or other relations who still remember it all too well as children. The conflict is not some distant history. It is still within graspable living memory. It is not some distant history. It is still within oh, hell. Sorry, I repeated that. The stories in this book touch on many different aspects of the war. There are epic naval encounters between Titanic warships and monumental battles between armies of hundreds of thousands of men. But there are also single-handed duels between opposing snipers and other tales of lonely individuals facing the most certain death. For those who survived the war, it would remain the most intense, vivid experience of their lives. Many of those who died were in their late teens or early 20s, and many of them would still be alive today if had not the war come to sent them away. The Second World War was fought between two great power blocks. On one side was the Axis, an alliance of Germany, Italy, and Japan, who were also joined by Hungary, Romania, and Belgiura. On the other side were the Allies, principally Britain and her empire, Soviet Russia, and the United States. These gargantuan forces faced off each other in four major areas, fighting Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the USSR, North Africa, and the Eastern Pacific, Southeast Asia. See maps, I'll look at that later. The cause of any war is usually too complex to reduce to a simple explanation. But in essence, the Second World War was caused by the desire of the Axis powers to gain empires, and the unwillingness of the Allies to let them. Nazi director Adolf Hitler dreamed of Lebensraum, living space, in Eastern Europe, and Russia for his German master base. Mazzullian wanted to create a new Roman Empire for Italy. Japan's military rulers sought to take over the Asian and Pacific territories, fading European powers and seas for their own empires in previous centuries. The war began with the German invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. Here, Polish cavalry charged against German tanks were predictably disastrous results. It ended on September 2nd, 1946, 6 years and a day later, when Japan finally surrendered, following the destruction of two of her cities by atomic bombs. At first, Germany and her allies made spectacular advances, and almost all of Europe fell under their control. This was largely due to the effective fighting strength of the German army and their Blitzkrieg lightning war tactics. Here, tanks, aircrafts, and other powered vehicles were used to make fast and highly effective work of opposing armies. In the first 2 years of war, only Britain held out, protected from an invasion by its Air Force, Navy, and the English Channel. the Battle of Britain, and the first significant aerial battle in history, was Hitler's first defeat. With Britain isolated at the edge of containment, Hitler turned to his chief ambition, the conquest of the Soviet Russia. The invasion on June 22nd, 1941, was the greatest in history. By the autumn of that year, German troops were at the gates of Leningrad and Moscow, but a suicidal resistance by Red Army troops and the onset of the ferocious Russian winter prevented Hitler from snatching his greatest prize. On the other side of the war, Germany's ally, Japan, had been establishing her own empire on the Asian Pacific seaboard. On December 7th, she attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. So began a devastating campaign, which saw her enemies sweep through the Philippines and Malaya, then down to Java and Burma, to threaten both Australia and India. When Japan attacked the United States, Hitler also declared war on the Americans, despite the fact that he also still had to defeat the British and Russians. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was ecstatic. So we had won the war after all. Our history would not come to an end, he reflected that night. Hitler's fate was sealed. As for the Japanese, they would be ground to a powder. All the rest was merely the proper application of overwhelming force. He was absolutely right. Germany and Japan had decided to wage war against the most powerful nation on earth. America responded to their challenge by diverting her vast industrial strength to winning the war. In 3.5 years, her dockyards built 1,020 new warships. By 1944, her factories were producing one new warplane every 5 minutes. Quite aside from the mammoth expenditure. I don't know how to say that. Expenditure. $2 billion was still found to fund the development of the world's first atomic weapons. In the summer of 1942, American, British, and Commonwealth troops began to claw back territory seized by Japan in the first 6 months of the Pacific War. In North Africa, a British victory against German and Italian troops at El Alamein in October 1942 scotched any possibilities that German and Japanese troops would link up in India. The victory was allowed for the American, British invasions of Italy from the south, which took place in July 1943. During 1942, the Soviets began to recover from the invasion of 1941. Their armies were better equipped both from their own factories and substantial American and British arms imports. Their soldiers had become a formidable fighting force. When Russian troops destroyed the German 6th Army at Stalingrad over the winter of 1942 and 1943, the war in the East turned into a slow retreat that ended with the Soviet occupation of the German capital, Berlin. On June 1944, American, British, and Canadian troops took part in the D-Day landings in Normandy. Now Hitler's army had to fight on 3 fronts: Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and Italy. Within a year, the war in Europe was over. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945, and on May 8th, Germany surrendered. Japan lasted through to the summer until its devastating atomic bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Novelist John Steinbeck's description of the war, as dirty as a business the world had ever seen, seemed a fair epigraph. At least 55 million people died as a direct result of it. I just want to say, after reading the book though, this is outside of it, but no one is entirely sure if Hitler did commit suicide, as there were cities, I believe, that they could flee to. That's just a little thing I studied a bit to myself. The end of part